In the last few hours, the White House released a statement saying that the president won't terminate Nafta. Not at this time. He spoke with both the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Mexican President Enrique Pena Nieto.
Trump says he'll hold off on scrapping Nafta and that he will bring the trade agreement up to date through renegotiation. The Mexican peso surged on the news. Joining us now in the studio, BMO Global Asset Management economist Steve Bell. Great to have you on the programme. We'll talk about tax in a moment, talking about this trade news that we've had overnight. I mean, reading the press release, some of the parts of the statement from the White House, almost sounds like a different person to the campaign trail. Trump saying, "It is my privilege to bring Nafta up to date through renegotiation. It is an honour to deal with both leaders," talking about Canada and Mexico, "and I believe that the end result will make all three countries stronger and better." This sounds like a much more collaborative Trump on trade. Is this a new era?
He's been converted, hasn't he, to globalisation. He wouldn't use that word. Well, first of all, he's been lobbied by lots of American companies that benefit from Nafta. And actually, there are some changes they could make that would be enormously beneficial to Mexico, increasing the rule of origin rules, which basically mean more value added in Mexico for companies like Japanese companies who sort of assemble bits and then export it to the United States. But although he's saying this about amending NAFTA, which has been amended several times, they've still imposed tariffs on Canadian softwood and are about to impose tariffs on Canadian dairy.
Yeah, it seemed like a volte-face in tone, at least, over 24 hours, didn't it, Miles?
Yeah, I mean, he's capitulated essentially on China. He's volte-faced over foreign policy. And is he trying to sort of rein back his rhetoric when you see this kind of discussion north and south of the border?
Yes, and I don't know, when you do a volte-face 3 or 4 times, what is it, a somersault, a tumble, flick-flack, I don't know. But
he probably would disagree that it was a volte-face at all, but anyway.
I mean, there certainly is a tendency for outrageous statements, often tweeted, a mechanism for communicating with the outside world that is not traditional in the Oval Office or indeed any other place. And then, you know, that may be what shooting from the hip type of comment, and then he becomes more reasonable. Particularly the administration, the Secretary, the Treasury, for example, and other people are more circumspect than the President himself. So it doesn't go through this filter of we can't say that, you can't. Let's consider what we're going to say. So it does tend to come out raw and overstated and then gets moderated.
It's been said many times that the tax plan that we got yesterday was short on detail, just 250 words or so, to 1 page of bullet points rather than a sort of tome to go through. But Gary Cohn says they're working on a lot of detail. That's going to come. Is there something to get excited about in those bullet points?
Excited about tax reform? Well, I mean, the Reagan plan that you referred to earlier, that was actually implemented in his second term and did follow a huge, very almost academic tone, which isn't the style of this administration. But the plan announced was much closer to the House and indeed the Senate plans. So you could say, ooh, this looks a bit like compromise and is therefore more likely to be passed.
Even with a 15% corporate tax rate in there, which we know Ryan's not a fan of, for
There's
example.
no border adjustment tax. There's a whole series of things which bring it closer, not in total, and that 15% plan, people do not expect that to be implemented. So I think, whereas the markets got very excited by the phenomenal tax cuts, remember those, that were going to be announced on Thursday, not this Thursday, several Thursdays ago, we now have something that possibly the market's given up on him passing anything. So I think we may be positively surprised by what we may have something at the end, towards the end of this year, rather than nothing. So maybe it's actually thin on detail, but more likely to produce an outcome.
Well, certainly what he wants to avoid is a propulsion in the dollar. And he has achieved that by the 250 words rather than a 500-page tome. But holding the dollar back, because this was the concern, that if he goes for a huge repatriation of earnings from overseas, and that looks even to be much less in terms of impact. That's the sense that we get from what I read overnight. A lot of the dollars held, a lot of the money held overseas is already in dollars. Yeah. He doesn't want to do something that brings dollars back and spooks the dollar higher.
That's true, and obviously we in the markets are very, very focused on that. I think his bigger issue is to try and get a tax plan through, and the biggest constraint there is not so much the dollar, but the question of whether it has to be revenue neutral. Now, what you can do in these plans is you can make up a number for economic growth, and that produces lots of taxes, shock horror, and nobody puts forward a tax plan without saying this is going to make the economy stronger and growth better. But some of the more conservative Republicans wanted to be properly revenue neutral, and that's much more difficult.